Hello everyone! Welcome to our module on barriers and conflict in interprofessional education and practice. This tends to be the module that learners are most keen to discuss. From looking at our surveys at the start of class, I think many of us are at least hoping to find a magic bullet that will fix interprofessional practice and education in our workplaces. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist. The barriers to effective interprofessional practice and education and the conflict that can arise are complex. However, that's not to say this is a hopeless situation. So we have two videos for you in this module. In this video, Dr. McMurtry is going to discuss our foundational reading by Pippa Hall about professional cultures as barriers to interprofessional teamwork. And this is from when he taught 5105 last year, so I believe he makes a couple of references to his course then, but we thought it was a really informative video, so we decided to use it again. And then after talking about our foundational reading, Angus will introduce a second school of thought for looking at professional knowledge differences in interprofessional and interdisciplinary work. And this will build on our discussion from Module 2 when we talked about complexity science and nested systems diagrams. So without further delay, let's pass things over to Angus.
Hello, 5105 interprofessional folks. This week we read about the social, cultural, and sociological factors that have been found to play a role in interprofessional collaboration, often inhibiting it. These include stereotypes about other professions, power imbalances and differences in language, behavior, values, identity, and so on. I'll briefly summarize the Hall article on professional cultures as barriers and go over a brief activity that I do in class for that. And more importantly, I will add value by talking about something that wasn't in the articles and argue that these sorts of social and cultural factors are good, but they're only one part of the story. That differences among professionals also have to do with the different phenomenon they interact with. Everything from cells to whole persons to social contexts. That is, there is more to professional differences than just social and cultural factors. I'll give you more detail on that when I get there. So let's start with the Hall article. This article written by Pippa Hall is very influential. There are almost 1,500 citations of it. So it's a bit old, but it's very influential. And it refers to Petrie, like many articles do, the reading we did last week. Here's what I see as the key points in the article. Just to say, the author, Pippa Hall, is actually a Ottawa person, and she works at Briere Hospital as well. She's a physician and academic, works in the area of family health care, humanities and medicine, and palliative care. And I collaborated with her about 10 years ago. Very nice person. So here are some of the key points from the article. She drew upon sociological literature and her own experience in healthcare to articulate these ideas. And one of them is that current professions have evolved in relation to one another. Each has its own culture as well, reflecting the historical power struggles, issues of gender, class, economics, and so on. Each professional culture has its own language, behavior, values, identities. These are internalized through the education and socialization processes. People work in it. Remember from the first class, I posted a little video on collective learning, and Vygotsky and social constructivists argue not just that social and cultural factors influence our thinking. They say that most truly human thinking originates in social practices and relationships. So what we do together, what we talk about together, that actually provides the raw materials for what we construct as our understanding of the world. So when professionals get socialized into particular practice, they internalize that practice. That becomes their way of thinking. I really saw this actually when I interviewed people from different occupations as a educational software developer making a career guide years ago. What we work in, who we socialize with at work regularly, really shapes our worldview and assumptions. Other points from this article is that much of this enculturation process is not visible. We're not really aware of it. Apparently about 90% of what we learn and know and how we act doesn't really pass through our conscious, explicit awareness. Another thing that she argues, and I'm not sure I agree with this, is that team member status should be equal. I might argue more, no, everyone has to be able to make a contribution, but some people may have more expertise in relation to certain issues, and they may have more experience, say on a in the healthcare context than others. So it's not so much equal as all being able to make a contribution, in my opinion. But in this article, it's argued more that it should be equal. And finally, student professionals need to become familiar with other professionals and learn teamwork skills. So along with Petrie, Hall is arguing that if we're going to get along and work together, we have to become familiar with people from other professions and learn the skills you need to work in teams, or at least to collaborate or network with other people. Now I'll just move on to a little activity I like to do in class. I won't be able to do, I was trying to think of how I could do this, and it would be tough to do in our class because we don't have any synchronous time. But I start by doing a little skit where I pretend to be a few characters from different sorts of professional backgrounds, and have a misunderstanding. I wear different hats to show that I'm the different characters, but then I get people in their discussion groups to talk about different experiences they've had with culture clashes in their own kind of work and education, and come up with a good story, even if it's each group will come up with a story, even if it pieces together different people's experiences, and then they'll actually rehearse it and present it as a very brief skit to the rest of the class. If you can use this in your own education, I encourage you to do so. It's kind of fun, and it gets people to break the ice with each other and relax a bit. And one of the reasons I go first is to set that atmosphere of, I can be vulnerable doing these roles, because I am certainly not a natural actor. If I'm out of my comfort zone, then they can do it too. Anyway, it's something that tends to work. Now on to the value added part here, where I talk about stuff that wasn't in the readings. I didn't have you guys read articles I've written on this. I decided instead that I just present it to you. So I've argued in several published articles that the sociocultural approach to interdisciplinary and interprofessional tensions, which seen through the Hall article and the stereotypes one a little bit too, can only ever be part of the story. Here I describe it on this, I put it on the left side of this slide, calling it the sociocultural knower-oriented approach, focusing on professional socialization, historical conflict, gender, class, and so on. That's an important way to explain professional differences and why people think differently. But to me, it's always only part of the story. The other part of the story, I think, is I wanted to draw attention to how different disciplinarians and professionals often interact with different sorts of phenomena. I guess you just call them things in the world. In healthcare, that might be, cells, organs, pharmaceuticals, bodily systems, psychology, behavior, social and economic context, epidemiology, and so forth. I argue that these different sorts of phenomena that professionals interact with, and the way these different phenomena behave, require professionals to think differently. So it's a matter of what they interact with, beyond humans, not just the socialization process, even though that is important. For example, the kind of thinking that a pharmacist applies to drugs and cells and organs and their interactions will have to be fundamentally different from the sort of thinking that a psychologist or a sociologist might apply to people's thinking and behavior in their social contexts. Both these sorts of thinking are valuable in dealing with human healthcare, but they're different. And I don't think those differences could be reduced just to enculturation alone. This argument is linked to complexity theory that I'm making here, with different kinds of professional knowledge linked to different levels of emergent complex systems. So say there's one complex system is our organs, and certain professionals might study organ function and dysfunction. Another emergent complex system might be the whole person, which is studied by psychologists, looking at their thinking, their behavior, and so on. Another level of emergent collective sort of complex system is social groups. And so sociologists might study how social norms emerge and how people adapt to those. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but this argument is linked to complexity and how different levels of complex systems follow different sorts of logic. If you really are interested, I can email you articles, just contact me. For now, I'll just show you a slightly bigger and more detailed depiction of the different levels of complex systems involved in healthcare. I'll give you a few moments to read it. But the idea is that the things on the left there, from bodily subsystems to systems to whole persons to social environments, these are different levels of emergent complex systems, and they follow different sorts of logic. Like, you can't understand what I do as a whole person just by looking at my bodily subsystems. A different sort of logic is needed to understand what goes on at each level, according to complexity theory. And so I've argued that these different levels each have different sorts of disciplines or professional insights attached to them. And so that this also explains why different professionals understand and think differently. You may very well ask, okay, fine and dandy, but how does all this help us deal with the practical challenges of interprofessional teamwork and collaboration? Here is one answer for that. I'm going to move on to a slide which shows one practical way in which these ideas, specifically the idea of multiple nested complex systems, can be used to facilitate teamwork. This was actually developed during my PhD thesis research 15 years ago at the University of Alberta. There was a huge interprofessional course. And one of the things they really had to get students to understand is, the profession they're studying, whether it's nursing or medicine or laboratory technology or dentistry or whatever. It's valuable. It's extremely valuable, but it's not the whole story. And if someone talks about a different sort of dimension of a complex problem, like say you have a patient with health issues, a drug addiction, and social and economic issues, say a physician and a pharmacist and a social worker and so on. They may have very different insights about how best to help this person. And those aren't contradictory. They're not opposites. They're just dealing with different levels. And so we use this chart to help the health profession students understand that when you're at a table with different professions and they're giving different things here, like someone's got an ulcer, you say, well, give them a pill, fix the ulcer. Now the person, I don't know, maybe a psychologist might say, let's get them in counseling so they don't drink so much and eat better and maybe get some exercise. And a social worker say, well, part of this might be, group counseling and, trying to ensure you get employment. And that might reduce, say, the drinking. So these are all relevant to, how most complex problems like, I guess ulcers in some cases at least are complex. But they need to be seen as complementary, not as contradictory. And that's what this chart helped people do. So this is one way to do that. It was actually brainstormed. I was talking about complexity theory and emergent levels and stuff like that. And I was talking to a dietitian who was a facilitator in this course. And together we realized that this could be very valuable. And so we developed this, and in the following year, it actually was successful enough that it became part of the core curriculum for all the students in this almost 1,000 student course. So what else do I want to say about this? So I guess one thing I'd like to say about the chart is that it had people focus on the patient care issues rather than on their personal and political tensions. Which is the latter, the personal and political tensions, is more a sociocultural kind of approach. I don't disagree with that. I think it's true, but I'm not sure that getting people to focus on the sociocultural stuff, like personal conflicts and how your enculturation is different from mine, I'm not sure that helps people get along and collaborate better. Maybe it's just me, but I would rather focus on the issues and getting the job done than on my feelings and tensions. I figured, if teams or groups get the job done, if they do collaborate on solving a problem, that feelings kind of take care of themselves. But that's just my view. Okay, now to get back to the two schools of thought here, I guess to summarize, when people talk about professional tensions and differences, realize that there can be many sources, including both the sociocultural factors dealt with in the article we read this week and the differences between the different sorts of complex systems studied by professionals, which is more what I tried to add to the literature. It's not just one or the other, it's both. Also, different perspectives are not opposites or irreconcilable necessarily. In fact, they can complement one another. We just need to take a bigger view and realize that our profession's insight is valuable, but it's not the only insight relevant to most cases of complex patient care. If you can find ways to really bring this point home to your own students, the way I did with the chart that I just described, then you can better facilitate collaboration. And good luck with that. That's really it for this week. I hope it's a good week for you guys.